Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into the history of Sweden. We've gathered quite a range of sources to explore its cultural, socio-political, and economic journey right from the beginning up to today.
That's right. And our goal here is to really distill the key insights from Sweden's, well, very long past for you. So if you're looking to get up to speed quickly but thoroughly, we're aiming to pinpoint the forces that have really shaped Sweden's unique character.
Exactly. And hopefully we'll uncover some surprising facts, maybe a few aha moments along the way. We promise to keep it engaging, no information overload, just the essentials needed to grasp how Sweden evolved from its prehistoric roots to its current global role. Okay, let's dive in.
So our journey starts way back in prehistoric Sweden. As the glaciers retreated after the last ice age, Mesolithic hunter-gatherer groups began to arrive. We find evidence of them, their advanced stone tools, even some quite intricate artwork at various archaeological sites.
It's amazing to imagine those first societies, their connection to the land. Then, around 4000 BCE, things changed dramatically with the Neolithic period, didn't they? The start of agriculture.
Precisely, a huge shift. People began cultivating crops, domesticating animals. It fundamentally altered how people lived in that region.
And following that, we get the Bronze Age. Starting around 1800 BCE, what marks that era?
Well, the big thing is bronze metalworking, obviously. Bronze tools, weapons, they become much more common, gradually pushing out the older stone tools. This technological leap likely changed craftsmanship, maybe even social structures.
It wasn't just about the metal itself, right? Trade seems to have picked up too, within Sweden and further afield in Northern Europe.
Oh, definitely. Trade networks expanded significantly, and this likely led to, well, fascinating cultural exchanges. You see similarities popping up in religious practices, artistic styles across different areas. We even find ritual sites suggesting, ancestor worship, a deep connection to nature.
Suggesting a real level of interaction between these early groups.
Exactly. That shared cultural language points to significant interconnectedness. Then comes the Iron Age, maybe around 500 BCE. Iron tools become key, often more practical than bronze.
And this period seems more complex socially, more organized settlements, fortifications.
Yeah, we see more elaborate settlement patterns emerging, fortified structures, more organized agriculture. It suggests societies were becoming more hierarchical, perhaps with specialized roles, maybe driven by the need for defense, managing resources.
More conflict, maybe.
The archaeological record does suggest that, yes, increasing conflict, competition, demanding more strategic thinking and social organization. This whole era really laid the groundwork for what comes next, the famous Viking Age.
And it's fascinating. Our sources even suggest these prehistoric themes echo much later in things like Swedish opera centuries down the line. Like the very first stories never quite faded away.
Okay, let's move into that iconic era, the Viking Age. Right, the Viking Age. Generally, we're talking about 793 to 1066 AD. It's a truly transformative time for Scandinavia. The Vikings, originating from modern Sweden, Norway, Denmark, these seafaring Norse people became renowned for, well, their incredible shipbuilding and navigation.
The long ships, that's the image everyone has, isn't it? Sleek, powerful boats.
Absolutely crucial. Those ships were the key to their expansion, their exploration, raiding, yes, but also their extensive trade.
And their reach was just astounding. Across Europe, North Africa, maybe even North America.
It was remarkably wide. British Isles, mainland Europe, North Africa, and yes, there's compelling evidence suggesting possible early contact with North America. But it's vital to remember, they weren't just raiders, they were traders, settlers too.
Right, those trade networks were huge, stretching all the way to the Byzantine Empire, even Baghdad, apparently, exchanging furs, amber, slaves, silver.
A sophisticated economic dimension, definitely. They connected vast distances, and they established significant colonies, Iceland, Greenland, parts of England, Ireland. These weren't just brief stops, they put down roots.
And culturally, their impact is huge. The mythology, the art, those old Norse sagas giving us glimpses into their world. Plus, the way they mixed with other cultures.
Yes. That interaction led to a real blend, a cultural fusion. You see traces in language, customs across Europe, and their legacy lives on archaeology, place names, cultural practices in Scandinavia today. They left a deep mark.
A formidable presence then, warriors, explorers, traders, cultural forces. Let's dig into their origins a bit more specifically. Where did these Vikings actually come from?
Well, their roots are in Scandinavia during the late Iron Age, say 6th to late 8th century AD. It was a period of significant change, societal, technological, cultural, in what's now Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. This set the stage.
And the environment must have played a huge part. That harsh northern climate, the rugged landscape.
Absolutely. Limited farmland likely pushed communities towards the sea fishing, coastal trade, and eventually large-scale seafaring. That relationship with the sea became central to their identity, key to their expansion.
And the technology, those long ships again, they were real game changers.
They certainly were. Mastery in building these versatile ships, capable of handling rough seas and shallow rivers, was pivotal. That, plus sophisticated navigation skills, opened up connections across previously unimaginable distances.
It's also interesting you mentioned political decentralization back then. Local chieftains, competition.
That's a sharp point. That fragmented landscape, with chieftains vying for power and resources, likely fueled the outward drive for wealth, land, prestige. And don't forget their religion, Odin, Thor, Freyja, the emphasis on valor, Valhalla, that encouraged martial skill, risk-taking.
You can really see how all these things, environment, tech, politics, religion, kind of came together to spark the Viking Age. So where did these origins take them? Let's talk about the expeditions.
The Viking expeditions, starting in the late 8th century, were just extraordinary in scope and impact, driven by, well, a mix of things: seeking wealth, plunder, and trade, maybe overpopulation at home, the lure of fertile land elsewhere, not just one reason.
And their reach was incredible. British Isles, Byzantium, maybe North America, as you said.
Their first major hit on the British Isles, Lindisfarne Monastery in 793, really announced their arrival and had a massive impact. They didn't just raid and leave, they settled, formed political areas like the Danelaw in England.
And they didn't stop there. Italy, Iberia, Russia.
No, they raided along the Italian peninsula, the Iberian coast, and ventured deep into Russia via the rivers, like the Volga. Their adaptability was key. They often integrated with locals, creating settlements, mixing cultures. Some even became elite mercenaries, like the Varangian Guard in Byzantium shows their reputation.
And beyond the military stuff, the trade networks are vital, stretching from Baghdad to potentially North America, exchanging all sorts of goods.
Absolutely. It highlights how multifaceted they were. Their exploration legacy and those trade routes they carved out influenced navigation and economics for centuries. They weren't just destroyers, they were connectors too.
Clearly a dominant force on many levels. Let's shift to their cultural impact, especially back home in Sweden.
The Viking cultural impact is deeply woven into Swedish identity, influencing later culture, especially music. The Viking era, late 8th to early 11th centuries, provided this rich source of myths that saw a huge revival during national romanticism around 1900, a real rediscovery of heritage.
And that's when these ancient myths found their way into Swedish opera. How did that work?
Yes, exactly. Major Swedish composers then, Andreas Halland, Wilhelm Stenhammar, Wilhelm Petersen Berger, they drew heavily on Viking myths and sagas for their operas. Works like Harold Viking, Turfing, Arnjot are prime examples. These weren't just history lessons set to music. They captured the spirit of that time.
So it was more than storytelling. It was about using this mythology to build and celebrate a distinct Swedish identity during that national awakening.
Precisely. Viking culture became a huge source of national pride, a key part of constructing a shared Swedish heritage during national romanticism. Choosing Viking themes was a conscious cultural statement, meant to build collective identity, connect to a perceived glorious past.
And this cultural focus actually boosted Sweden's international profile around the turn of the 20th century.
It did. It played a big role in Sweden, emerging as a significant music exporting nation then. It wasn't just art for art's sake. It reflected national enthusiasm and specific goals for Sweden's cultural standing internationally. Embracing Viking themes resonated both at home and, maybe surprisingly, abroad, shaping a distinct cultural profile.
Remarkable how those Viking echoes kept resonating, shaping culture and national pride centuries later. Okay, let's journey forward into the Middle Ages in Sweden.
Right, the Middle Ages in Sweden, roughly 11th to 16th century. This was a time of major political, religious, and cultural change. One huge development was the gradual shift from Norse paganism to Christianity, a profound reorientation.
A massive shift indeed. What drove that conversion?
It started late 10th century, pushed by Christian missionaries, often backed by rulers who saw advantages in aligning with Christian Europe. Building churches, bishoprics, monasteries, these formal structures were key. It eventually led to Sweden joining the broader European cultural sphere, aligning with the Catholic Church, which later paved the way for the Church of Sweden.
And the church then wasn't just about religion, was it? It held a lot of sway in society.
Oh, absolutely. The church became central, influencing religious life, yes, but also education, governance. Church leaders often held significant political power, intertwined with the monarchy. They were key in shaping laws, social norms.
Politically, was this also when Sweden started consolidating power under kings?
Yes, we see a centralized monarchy gradually emerging. Figures like Eric the Holy, who became the patron saint, and especially Birger Jarl, were crucial. Birger Jarl is credited with unifying Swedish lands, founding Stockholm, and setting up early forms of a feudal system.
But it wasn't all internal development. Conflicts with neighbors, expansionist ambitions.
Definitely. And we also see the Kalmar Union emerge, a significant, though ultimately temporary, union bringing Sweden, Denmark, and Norway under one monarch. As we'll see, it was full of tension and eventually led to Sweden breaking free in the early 16th century.
Culturally, what was happening to shape a Swedish identity during this time?
This period laid crucial groundwork, preserving folklore, oral traditions, the start of written records like sagas and chronicles documenting Swedish history and legends. We also see Gothic architecture spreading in churches, cathedrals reflecting European trends, but also growing local craftsmanship.
And trade must have kept connecting Sweden to the wider world.
Absolutely. Interaction with the Hanseatic League, that powerful Baltic trading group, spurred economic development. Cities like Visby and Stockholm rose as major trading hubs, linking Sweden into the European economic network, bringing in new ideas.
So the Middle Ages really set the stage for the nation to come. Let's look closer at how the Kingdom of Sweden actually formed during this era.
Well, the formation wasn't a single event. It was a gradual process over centuries in the early Middle Ages. Before this, the area was a collection of tribes and petty kingdoms. The Sphere around Uppsala, the Gotar in the south, often with their own rulers, not unified.
So not one entity initially. How do they come together under one crown?
A key step was powerful local leaders starting to dominate neighbors. King Eric the Victorious, late 10th century, is often seen as a milestone. The first king ruling a larger, more unified territory in early Sweden. His successors, like Olaf Skupkonung, the first Christian king, built on that.
How did Christianity help with unification?
Embracing Christianity linked Sweden culturally and politically to the rest of Europe alliances, diplomacy. It also brought new administrative structures, legal ideas, often church-supported, which helped centralize power. And the idea of a king ruling by divine right, backed by the church, was a powerful unifying tool.
So religion provided shared identity and legitimacy for the early kingdom.
Absolutely. Christianity helped erode old tribal divisions, fostered shared identity based on faith. It gave cohesion and divine sanction to the king's authority, helping consolidate power and formally establish Sweden as a kingdom with laws and hereditary monarchs.
Fascinating how politics and religion were so intertwined. Now let's focus on the Catholic Church's influence during those formative centuries.
The Catholic Church's influence started with Christianization and grew steadily. It became indispensable, shaping not just spiritual beliefs, but the whole socio-political landscape of the emerging kingdom. Its reach was far broader than just faith.
In what specific ways did it exert such influence?
Well, it played a key role in establishing early education. Monasteries, cathedral schools became learning centers, bringing religious doctrine, yes, but also literacy, classical knowledge. This link to the wider European intellectual world was crucial. Priests, monks were often the literate ones, vital for administration.
So key in spreading knowledge and early bureaucracy. What about other aspects of life?
It permeated almost everything. Religious authority was tied to political governance. The church often played a big role in coronations, giving kings religious legitimacy. Church law influenced marriage, inheritance, morals. They often advised rulers, influencing Swedish law development.
Of course, that close relationship changed dramatically later with the Reformation.
That's crucial. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, led by Gustav Vasa, meant Sweden broke from the Catholic Church, established Lutheranism. This drastically cut the Catholic Church's direct political power.
But centuries of Catholicism left a huge marker of traditions, culture, the churches themselves.
And the Lutheran Church then became the state church for a very long time.
Indeed. The Lutheran Church of Sweden was the state church right up until the year 2000. Only recently did they formally separate, leading to a more pluralistic religious scene and more cooperation between denominations. But the foundational influence of the Catholic Church during the medieval period is undeniable.
A clear example of how religion and power shaped medieval Sweden. Let's shift to a major political project of that era, the Kalmar Union. The Kalmar Union is a really interesting, though short-lived, chapter, an ambitious attempt at regional unity. It came out of complex diplomacy and political maneuvering in the late 14th century, formally set up in 1397. It aimed to unite Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under one crown.
What was the main motivation? Why try to unite these three kingdoms?
Two main goals, really. First, consolidate strength against external threats, especially the powerful Hanseatic League in the Baltic and other rival powers. Second, to try and stop the constant internal conflicts and power struggles within the individual Scandinavian kingdoms, hoping for more regional stability.
Sounds logical on paper, but you said it was full of tension. Why?
A fundamental issue was the structure. United under one crown, yes, but each nation kept its own governance, laws, nobility. This lack of deep integration preserving national identities caused friction. Sweden, particularly its nobility, often felt Denmark dominated the union, that Swedish interests were secondary. This caused a lot of resentment.
So constant power struggles simmering beneath the surface.
Exactly. It led to periodic unrest, even open revolts, as factions in Sweden pushed for more autonomy, even independence. Figures like Engelbrektsson, leading a major 15th century rebellion, became symbols of this resistance to perceived Danish control. These conflicts really weakened the union over time.
And eventually these tensions led to its collapse. Sweden broke away.
Yes, by the early 16th century, discontent in Sweden peaked. Gustav Vasa, a nobleman prominent in resisting Danish rule, skillfully used this dissatisfaction, led a successful rebellion, and restored Swedish independence in 1523. So the Kalmar Union, while ambitious, ultimately failed due to its structural weaknesses and clashing national interests.
A compelling case of unity versus national identity shaping politics. Let's move into the early modern period, after the Kalmar Union dissolved.
Right, the early modern period, roughly late 15th to early 18th century, a time of huge transformation, moving Sweden towards modernity. The Vasa dynasty, starting with Gustav Vasa in 1523, was pivotal.
He secured independence, right? What else was significant about his reign?
Correct. He ended the Kalmar Union, established sovereignty, but he also significantly reorganized the government. And crucially, he pushed through the Protestant Reformation in Sweden. That had massive religious, political, economic consequences, laying foundations for a more centralized, stable state with religious uniformity.
So strengthening internal structures. What about Sweden's place in Europe then?
After independence and consolidation under the Vasas, Sweden developed significant geopolitical ambitions. He got involved in conflicts across the Baltic against Denmark, Poland, Russia. By the mid-17th century, through military success and strategy, Sweden had become a major power in Northern Europe.
The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 is often mentioned. What did that mean for Sweden?
Westphalia ended the 30 Years' War. It marked a high point for Sweden's international prestige. As a victor, Sweden gained significant territory in northern Germany and a powerful voice in European affairs. It confirmed Sweden's status as a major European power, reflecting the military skill and diplomacy of monarchs like Gustav II Adolf.
And culturally, alongside all this politics and war, what was happening inside Sweden?
The early modern period also saw growing engagement with European arts and sciences, often backed by royal patronage. Protestantism impacted education. Monastic schools declined, secular education grew. Uppsala University gained prominence. Early Swedish opera started appearing, sometimes drawing on national myths, foreshadowing the later national romanticism. It showed a nation connecting to Europe, but also exploring its own identity.
Sounds like a crucial period shaping the Sweden, we know, power, religion, culture. Let's zoom in on a specific part of this, the Swedish Empire.
The Swedish Empire, mainly early 17th to early 18th century. This was Sweden's era of greatest territorial expansion. At its peak, he controlled not just modern Sweden, but Finland, Estonia, Latvia, parts of the eastern Baltic coast. A remarkable, though ultimately temporary, high point of Swedish power.
That's a huge area. How did a relatively small nation achieve that? What was their edge?
Primarily, it was driven by strategic military campaigns under ambitious kings like Gustavus Adolphus and later Charles XII. Plus, a remarkably effective, well-disciplined army that was, for its time, at the cutting edge of military innovation.
Gustavus Adolphus, father of modern warfare, his role was key.
Indeed. His military reforms, innovative tactics like mobile artillery, coordinated infantry, and inspiring leadership were crucial for early success in the 30 Years' War and establishing Sweden as a military powerhouse. Expansion was also helped by Sweden's resources, iron ore, timber supporting a strong metal industry, and military naval capability.
But ruling such a vast, diverse empire must have been challenging. How did they manage it?
A critical point. Administering these widespread territories, diverse populations, plus constantly funding military campaigns to hold and expand, put immense unsustainable strain on Sweden's finances and administration. These internal pressures, the resource drain from constant conflict, eventually contributed to the empire's decline after the costly Great Northern War.
And culturally, did this imperial era see a flourishing of arts reflecting that national power?
Yes, it coincided with a notable flourishing of arts and sciences, often with royal patronage, aiming to boost national prestige. Literature and art frequently reflected strong nationalistic fervor, celebrating patriotic themes, heroic exploits tied to imperial ambitions. We also see Baroque architecture becoming prominent, influenced by Europe, symbolizing Sweden's power and connection to broader European culture. These cultural developments laid groundwork for later nationalistic movements and a more defined Swedish identity.
So the empire was a time of great power, but also overextension, leaving a lasting mark. Let's look at a key conflict of that era, the 30 Years' War.
The 30 Years' War, 1618–1648, ravaged Europe, and Sweden played a crucial, decisive role. Sweden got involved mainly for strategic reasons, expanding influence in the Baltic, ensuring its security, but also religious motives, with King Gustavus Adolphus committed to defending Protestantism against the Catholic Habsburgs.
And Gustavus Adolphus entering the war in 1630 is seen as a major turning point. Why was his intervention so impactful?
Absolutely. His intervention shifted the war's trajectory dramatically. The Swedish army under him was exceptionally well organized, disciplined, and innovative, using mobile artillery, coordinated infantry effectively. They gained a formidable reputation. Plus, Gustavus Adolphus himself was a charismatic, effective leader whose strategic skill and presence were instrumental in early Swedish successes.
Sounds like his leadership was vital. What were the main outcomes for Sweden from the war?
Sweden's sustained involvement, even after Gustavus Adolphus died in battle in 1632, had huge consequences. Through key victories, Sweden helped weaken the Habsburgs and secured significant territory in northern Germany, establishing itself as a major power in northern Europe. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 formally recognized these gains and Sweden's enhanced influence, marking an era of Swedish preeminence in the Baltic and confirming its status on the European stage.
So the 30 Years' War was pivotal in making Sweden a major European power. Let's shift focus now to cultural developments, particularly around the start of the 20th century.
All right, the early 20th century in Sweden saw a significant cultural flourishing, deeply linked to the national romanticism movement. This trend emphasized national identity, folklore, history, and it really impacted music. Swedish composers actively turned to the nation's myths and history for inspiration.
So a deliberate effort to connect music with national heritage.
Precisely. Prominent composers consciously drew on Norse myths, sagas, historical events for their operas and other works. This preference for national themes wasn't just artistic expression. It aimed to boost national pride, foster a shared cultural heritage.
And Sweden's geographical position, its neutrality amidst all the alliances, did that affect its music scene?
Indeed. Its strategic location and neutrality created a unique environment. Musical institutions could thrive relatively undisturbed by direct conflict. This allowed a distinct Swedish musical infrastructure to develop. By the early 20th century, Sweden started gaining recognition as a music exporting nation, helped by deliberate music policies nurturing domestic work and promoting it abroad.
And it wasn't just classical music involved in this. Folk and popular music, too.
Absolutely. While national romanticism strongly influenced classical music, the broader scene was enriched by vibrant folk and popular traditions. Composers often incorporated folk elements, creating a rich, distinct tapestry, blending high art and popular forms. This dynamic mix further shaped Sweden's unique cultural identity and growing international presence.
Remarkable how politics, culture, and art intertwine to shape Sweden's identity and global influence. Let's turn now to a conflict that marked the decline of the Swedish Empire, the Great Northern War.
The Great Northern War, 1700 to 1721, was a huge turning point. It fundamentally reshaped the power balance in Northern Europe, marking Sweden's decline as a major power and the rise of Russia under Peter the Great. Sweden, under Charles XII, faced a powerful coalition. Russia, Denmark, Norway, Saxony, Poland, Lithuania, all challenging Swedish dominance.
A major shift. Sweden had been so dominant. You mentioned the Battle of Poltava as the key turning point.
Absolutely right. Sweden had early successes, like the Battle of Narva in 1700, which seemed to confirm their military might. But the catastrophic defeat at Poltava in 1709 was decisive, a crushing loss that crippled Sweden's military and political influence in the region. It marked the start of the empire's decline and paved the way for Russia's rise as the dominant Baltic power.
And such a devastating war must have impacted society deeply, beyond the battlefield, civilian life, culture.
Indeed. The war had far-reaching, long-lasting effects. We glimpse this even in personal records, like the autograph book of Adam Andrei, a pastor in Riga during the conflict. While mostly personal or religious, his entries mention events like the burning of Riga's outskirts in 1700, the Russian invasion of Livonia, shows how major conflicts permeated everyday life.
So even personal writings reflect the war's impact. What actually caused this massive war? Why did this coalition challenge Sweden?
It was a complex mix. Political, economic, territorial motives. Decades of Swedish expansion in the 17th century built resentment among neighbors who wanted lost lands back. Russia, under Peter the Great, crucially wanted access to the Baltic Sea for modernization and trade. The perceived weakness after Charles XI died and the young, inexperienced Charles XII took over also emboldened them. Shifts in European politics, like the War of Spanish Succession, left Sweden somewhat isolated. Plus, the economic importance of Baltic trade fueled desire to break Sweden's hold. Rising nationalism also played a part.
A perfect storm of grievances, ambitions, and opportunity. You mentioned Narva and Poltava. Could you elaborate on their significance?
Certainly. They really defined the war's path. Narva, 1700, was an early, stunning Swedish victory against a much larger Russian force, boosting Charles XII's reputation. But Poltava, 1709, was the game-changer. Peter the Great's modernized Russian army crushed the Swedes. This defeat crippled Sweden, marked the start of its decline in Eastern Europe, and cemented Russia's rise. Charles XII fleeing to the Ottoman Empire complicated things further. Later battles, like Staket, 1719, a minor Swedish naval win near Stockholm, showed resilience but didn't change the outcome. Narva, and especially Poltava, dramatically showed the shifting fortunes.
Clearly, the Great Northern War had huge consequences, ending Sweden's time as a major power. What were the long-term effects on society and culture?
The defeat spurred significant changes over the following centuries. One interesting long-term effect linking back was Sweden eventually emerging as a prominent music exporter by the early 20th century. This was helped by strategic music policies and international outreach. The earlier national romanticism, emphasizing Swedish myths and history in music, shaped a distinct cultural identity that could then be exported. Promoting cultural exports became part of Sweden's soft power. Also, the post-empire focus likely contributed to developing the comprehensive welfare state later in the 20th century, as focus shifted inward to social well-being. So these cultural and social paths were, in ways, long-term responses to the shifts caused by the war.
So even from a major setback, seeds of later cultural and social strengths were sown. Let's move to the period after Charles XII's death, the Age of Liberty.
The Age of Liberty, 1718 to 1772, was a significant period of change. After the autocratic King Charles XII died, there was a dramatic power shift. Royal absolutism ended, and the Swedish parliament, the Riksdag, gained substantial authority and influence.
So, the king's death empowered the Riksdag. What defined this new political setup?
The key feature was the Riksdag becoming the central political power. The monarchy's influence was deliberately reduced. The Riksdag, with representatives from the four estates, nobility, clergy, burghers, peasants, became the main legislative body. It was a big move towards decentralized governance, laying early groundwork for Sweden's later democracy.
And economically, what was happening during this Age of Liberty?
There was a real push for economic modernization and diversification. Less reliance on just agriculture and forestry, policies aimed to encourage new industries, foster trade. Mercantilism was the dominant idea.
Mercantilism, could you briefly explain that?
Sure. Basically, government actively intervening to maximize exports, minimize imports, create a favorable trade balance, build national wealth. In Sweden, then, it meant government supporting domestic industries, mining, textiles, iron with subsidies, protectionism, managing tariffs, trade barriers carefully to shield local industries, promote innovation. Institutions like guilds were strengthened to regulate trade, ensure quality, develop skills. The goal was greater self-sufficiency, stronger international trade position.
So, major political and economic restructuring. What about culture? Did this new focus on liberty affect intellectual life?
Absolutely. It was a fertile time for intellectual and artistic work, heavily influenced by the European Enlightenment. The emphasis on reason, rights, knowledge fostered an environment encouraging inquiry, expression. We saw big developments in literature, science, education. Academies, learned societies were founded, reflecting interest in scientific progress, rational thought. Literature, art flourished, often focusing on conveying ideas, social commentary through novels, poetry, theater. It was a cultural renaissance, reflecting the political and economic shifts, contributing to a national identity, embracing freedom and intellect.
Sounds like the Age of Liberty was pivotal, setting the stage for modern Sweden. Let's look at how political changes continued into the 20th century.
Throughout the 20th century, Sweden's politics were heavily shaped by its consistent policy of neutrality during the major global conflicts, WWI, the Cold War. This stance really influenced its domestic and international path, letting it focus internally and carve out a distinct global role.
And a huge part of that 20th century political story was building the famous welfare state.
Yes, developing that robust welfare state, emphasizing social security. Public services for citizen well-being became a defining feature of Sweden's political identity by the mid-20th century. Driven largely by social democracy, prioritizing healthcare, education, social support as fundamental rights.
We also talked about national romanticism around 1900. How did that cultural movement connect with politics then?
That surge of national romanticism definitely impacted political discourse too. The emphasis on shared national identity, rooted in history and culture, strengthened national cohesion and influenced political initiatives supporting cultural unification, preserving heritage through education and arts funding.
And later in the 20th century, especially post-WWII, how did Sweden's global political role evolve given its neutrality?
Its neutral stance allowed it to become an influential player in international diplomacy, focusing on humanitarian aid, conflict resolution, promoting cooperation. While not aligned with East or West during the Cold War, it actively engaged in international forums, built a reputation as a mediator, a voice for peace. Domestically, the social democratic model continued shaping priorities, equality, economic stability, comprehensive welfare reforms.
So the 20th century cemented Sweden's image: neutral, socially progressive, internationally engaged, even without major military alliances. Let's turn to the significant economic developments of that century.
Sweden's 20th century economic story is remarkable, transforming from mainly agrarian to a leading industrial nation. This built on late 19th century industrialization, gaining huge momentum. Abundant natural resources, especially timber and iron ore, were key exports, forming the base for a strong manufacturing sector.
And manufacturing and steel, forestry really drove growth. What other industries became big?
Indeed, steel and forestry were crucial springboards. The 20th century saw a robust manufacturing sector grow, covering steel, machinery, forestry products. Plus, iconic companies emerged: Volvo, Saab in automotive, Ericsson in telecommunications, boosting industrial output and global presence. This rapid industrialization profoundly impacted the economy, jobs, urbanization, higher living standards.
You mentioned the Swedish model earlier. How did that shape 20th century economic development?
The Swedish model was absolutely central. Really taking shape mid-century, it aimed to balance market capitalism with comprehensive social welfare, underpinned by strong unions and significant government regulation. The 1938 Saltsjöbaden Agreement, fostering cooperative labor relations, was key. Post-WWII saw unprecedented economic expansion as this model became fully operational: rapid industrial growth, full employment, modernized infrastructure and services. While Sweden faced challenges and reforms later to adapt to globalization, the core ideas of welfare, relatively equal income distribution, strong safety net remained highly influential.
Sounds like a century of dramatic economic change, marked by industrial growth and that unique socioeconomic model. Now, let's explore the cultural advances during the same period.
The 20th century was definitely pivotal for Swedish culture, especially music. Sweden emerged as a significant global player, a major exporter of music, influenced by its unique geopolitical position. While the early century had strong national romanticism composers using history, myths, Swedish music also broadened to embrace contemporary international styles.
So, connected to national themes, but also diverse and globally engaged. What role did government policies play in this musical transformation and export success?
Government policies and cultural institutions were crucial. Strategic music politics, as our source calls it, supported creation, production, distribution of Swedish music, home and abroad. Funding for music education, support for artists, initiatives promoting Swedish music internationally. While early 20th century national romanticism gave a strong identity in classical opera, later the century saw popular and folk music also gain international appeal. Swedish musicians constantly innovated, adapted to global trends, contributing to a dynamic scene. Challenges of export were met with creativity and strategic effort.
Fascinating how Sweden navigated the 20th century neutral, building a welfare state, achieving economic growth, and becoming a major cultural force, especially in music. Let's turn now to the turbulent Napoleonic Wars and Sweden's complex role then.
During the Napoleonic Wars, early 19th century, Sweden navigated a really precarious, shifting landscape of alliances and conflict. Initially, it tried neutrality, avoiding direct involvement, but strategic opportunities and external pressures eventually pulled it in.
And initially, Sweden sided with Britain against Napoleon.
Why? Yes. The early alignment with Britain was driven largely by shared economic interests, especially maritime trade, and mutual opposition to France's growing dominance.
Yeah.
The British alliance was also strategically key for Sweden's navy and trade access, given French control on the continent. But this alliance came at a steep price.
You mean losing Finland to Russia in 1809? How did that happen, and what were the consequences?
Exactly. Siding with Britain led to war with Russia, resulting in the painful loss of Finland in 1809, formalized by the Treaty of Frederikshamn. A huge territorial loss, reducing Baltic influence and causing major political upheaval inside Sweden. King Gustav I Adolf was deposed, a real turning point.
And this led to Charles III then adopting Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, a French marshal, as heir. Seems like a dramatic shift. Why?
Selecting Bernadotte, a respected French marshal, was a pragmatic move aimed at securing Sweden's position, maybe hoping his French connections could offer protection or leverage. However, as Crown Prince and later King Charles IV, Bernadotte made a decisive pivot. Seeing the shifting tides, he led Sweden away from France and joined the Sixth Coalition against Napoleon in 1813, a crucial strategic realignment.
And this switch ultimately led to Sweden gaining Norway in 1814. That was significant.
Yes, as a reward for joining the coalition, and through diplomacy and military action, Sweden was promised compensation. The 1814 Treaty of Kiel formalized transferring Norway from Denmark to Sweden. Acquiring Norway, while compensating for Finland, also shifted the Nordic power balance. The Sweden-Norway Union lasted until 1905, providing Sweden a strategic counterweight for much of the 19th century. Sweden's actions then really highlight the delicate power balance in 19th century Europe and its efforts to maintain sovereignty.
So the Napoleonic Wars meant big territorial changes and a fundamental foreign policy reorientation for Sweden. Let's consider Sweden's role in the major 20th century conflicts now.
Throughout the 20th century, Sweden stuck to its long-standing policy of official neutrality during both World Wars and the Cold War. This consistent stance profoundly influenced its approach to global conflicts and its domestic development.
And this 20th century neutrality, as you said, allowed focus on internal development and cultural emergence, like in music.
Exactly. Neutrality in WWI involved carefully balancing relationships and trade with both sides. During WWII, its neutral position allowed it to be a hub for diplomacy and humanitarian aid, sheltering refugees. Interestingly, this neutrality period also saw a flourishing of Swedish culture, strong articulation of national identity in arts and music, often drawing on national romantic themes. This relative cultural insulation provided space for Sweden to develop as a global leader in certain cultural fields.
So 20th century neutrality wasn't just about avoiding war, it created a unique context for internal, social, economic, cultural development shaping modern identity. Let's go back to the Napoleonic era and focus on that Treaty of Kiel, which had such a big impact on Scandinavia.
The Treaty of Kiel, January 14, 1814, was truly pivotal. It fundamentally reshaped Northern Europe's political map after the Napoleonic Wars. It formally ended hostilities between Denmark, Norway, and the Allies, UK, and Sweden.
And the biggest outcome was forcing Norway from Danish to Swedish control. Huge repercussions.
Precisely correct. Under Kiel, the King of Denmark-Norway had to cede Norway to Sweden's King Charles III. This dissolved the Denmark-Norway Union existing since 1380, significantly altering the region. The strategic aim was strengthening Sweden, reducing Danish influence. Denmark kept Greenland, Iceland, Faroe Islands, but losing Norway was a major blow. Importantly, the treaty said Norway should have a constitution, leading to the Norwegian constitution in May 1814. This assertion of sovereignty, even under Swedish rule, set up future tensions. Kiel reflected broader European power shifts, heavily influenced by British diplomacy aiming to counterbalance France and strategically position Sweden.
A clear example of major power shifts, redrawing maps, and altering destinies. Let's move to the direct consequence, the union between Sweden and Norway.
The union between Sweden and Norway, established 1814 after the Napoleonic Wars, was a unique setup. Two separate kingdoms joined under one monarch, but each kept its own government, laws, institutions. A direct result of the Treaty of Kiel forcing Denmark to cede Norway.
But, as we touched on, it wasn't smooth sailing. Persistent tension from Norway wanting more autonomy.
A very accurate observation. The 19th century relationship was characterized by unease, fueled by growing Norwegian national identity and desire for self-governance. While the Union fostered some economic and cultural ties and saw pan-Scandinavian ideas, the core tension over Norway's autonomy persisted and grew.
And this eventually led to the peaceful dissolution in the early 20th century.
Yes, by the early 1900s, internal politics in Norway created a strong, unified movement for independence. In 1905, it culminated in a national referendum, where Norwegians overwhelmingly voted to dissolve the Union. This was achieved peacefully through diplomacy. Norway then established its own sovereign monarchy, electing Prince Karl of Denmark as King Haakon VII, the definitive end of the Union, solidifying Norway's independence.
So the Union was significant for both, marked by cooperation, but ultimately Norway's peaceful assertion of independence. Let's delve deeper into how this union initially formed.
Its formation in 1814 stemmed directly from the turbulent post-Napoleonic geopolitics. Kiel mandated Denmark cede Norway to Sweden, but the Norwegians wanted self-determination. In spring 1814, they held the Eidsvoll Assembly, drafted a liberal constitution, declared independence on May 17th.
So an immediate clash between the treaty terms and Norwegian aspirations.
Precisely. Sweden, under Charles III, was determined to enforce Kiel. This led to a brief Sweden-Norway war in summer 1814, but it was short. Negotiations followed. These led to the Convention of Moss, August 14, 1814. This set the terms for Norway entering a personal union with Sweden. Crucially, Moss recognized much of the Norwegian constitution, with only needed amendments for the union under a common monarch. Norway kept its parliament, Storting, laws, administration, but shared king. The union became official November 4, 1814, when the Storting elected Charles III as King of Norway, a complex process balancing Norwegian self-rule aspirations with Swedish regional dominance.
A delicate compromise setting up a unique relationship, though one that would evolve. Let's shift back to Sweden and its 20th century political dynamics, keeping this history in mind.
Sweden's 20th century politics involved carefully navigating geopolitics, cultivating international relations, and sticking to neutrality. During the Cold War, this meant balancing non-alignment with cooperation with Western nations. Sweden's intelligence sector maintained a consistent structure from WWII through the Cold War, adapting to evolving tech and global info. Capabilities enhanced due to rising tensions, the arms race. Its strategic location allowed monitoring the Baltic and Western USSR with U.S. support. Despite non-alignment, close ties with NATO countries existed: tech, defense, getting U.S. military tech, informal security guarantees. This careful balance defined a key aspect of its 20th century politics.
So even while neutral, Sweden was actively engaged internationally. You also mentioned national romanticism's influence around 1900. How did that connect with politics then?
That surge of national romanticism significantly impacted Sweden's political cultural fabric. The emphasis on national myth, history, heritage resonated in political discourse, boosting national identity and unity. This cultural nationalism often fueled political initiatives, strengthening national institutions, preserving traditions, promoting shared identity. The music infrastructure then, as we discussed, became intertwined, music seen as a powerful tool for expressing national sentiments.
Fascinating how politics and culture were so interconnected. Let's return to the union with Norway and the factors leading to its peaceful end.
The dissolution in 1905 was a pivotal, remarkably peaceful transition in Scandinavian politics. It ended the personal union established in 1814, driven by geopolitical necessity but always containing tensions over Norwegian aspirations.
Shared monarchy, separate governments. What were the specific friction points that led Norway to seek independence?
Throughout the 19th century, Norway consistently sought more autonomy. By the early 20th, tensions peaked, especially over foreign policy and diplomatic representation. Norway felt its interests weren't adequately represented by the Joint Diplomatic Corps, wanted its own. This became the catalyst. The Storting passed legislation for a separate Norwegian consular service. King Oscar II refused to sanction it, causing a crisis. The Norwegian government declared the union dissolved June 7, 1905.
And despite this declaration, the separation stayed peaceful.
A mix of factors: mutual recognition of sovereignty claims, commitment to negotiation over conflict. Sweden, though initially reluctant, recognized the strength of Norwegian feeling and democratic will. Negotiations led to the Karlsbad Agreement in September 1905, setting separation terms. This peaceful outcome reflected broader Scandinavian trends towards constitutionalism, national self-determination, even within monarchies. Norway's independence ushered in self-determination, redefined monarchy's role. Norway reorganized governance around republican ideals. Sweden focused on domestic reform, industrialization. The transition highlighted monarchy's increasingly symbolic role by mid-20th century, adapting to democratic norms.
A remarkable example of political separation handled with civility. Let's move fully into the 20th century now, a time of immense change.
Indeed, the 20th century was transformative for Sweden, sociopolitically, economically, culturally. Politically, as we've said, unwavering neutrality through the major conflicts was key.
And this neutrality allowed the famous welfare state to develop.
Exactly. Post-WWII saw the full implementation of a robust welfare state model, driven by social democracy, universal social services, healthcare, education. Economically, the transformation from agrarian to highly industrialized continued. Key industries, steel, automotive, telecom, became global players. Strong emphasis on innovation, tech development, research.
And culturally, Sweden became a major force, especially in music.
Absolutely. Early 20th century saw national romanticism flourish, influencing composers. Music became powerful, artistic expression, but also cultural diplomacy. Sweden emerged as a notable music exporter thanks to supportive infrastructure, music policies. Its musical journey reflected broader themes of identity, pragmatic engagement with the world.
So the 20th century saw Sweden consolidate and innovate neutral, welfare-oriented, culturally influential. Let's dig into its WWI experience and neutrality policy.
Sweden's 1914 neutrality decision was defining, but maintaining it was complex, delicate. Strategic location, trade ties with both Allied and Central powers made it tricky.
So not just declaring neutrality and staying isolated, real challenges.
Indeed. Careful diplomacy, intricate economic negotiations with both sides were needed to protect sovereignty, stability. Navigating trade routes near Germany and the Allied-controlled North Sea was complex. Sweden managed to sustain vital exports, iron ore, timber, machinery to both Britain and Germany. This trade sparked controversy, accusations of bias from both sides. Internally, neutrality impacted policy boosting domestic production, national rationing. Ultimately, through skillful diplomacy, economic maneuvering, military preparedness as deterrent, Sweden navigated WWI with territory and economy largely intact.
Sounds like impressive management in a turbulent time. Let's look at the interwar period. How did Sweden navigate that while staying neutral in an increasingly unstable Europe?
The interwar period saw Sweden adjusting politically, socially, economically, while holding on to neutrality. Early 20s had economic challenges, post-war recession, inflation, unemployment. But late 20s saw rebound, industrial growth, labor reforms, laying groundwork for the welfare state. Politically, delicate diplomacy post-Versailles. Rise of Nazi Germany in the 30s presented challenges, economic opportunities via trade, but moral dilemmas about fascism. Asylum policies faced scrutiny. Domestic and foreign policy became increasingly tied to Europe's shifting power balance. Sweden felt less impact from the Great Depression than many, likely due to earlier reforms, focus on self-sufficiency. By WWII's eve, a centrist coalition had fortified policies, ready to adapt while committed to neutrality.
So interwar was internal consolidation and careful maneuvering, sticking to neutrality in a volatile world. Now let's focus on Sweden's complex, debated role during WWII itself.
Sweden's WWII role involved a complex, often debated balance between neutrality and pressures from warring sides. Policies aimed primarily at survival, preserving independence while trying to uphold democratic ideals, under scrutiny from both Axis and allies. Early war, especially after Germany invaded Denmark and Norway in 1940, brought real fears of invasion. Sweden mobilized military, fortified defenses as deterrent. Economically, it was a crucial iron ore supplier to Germany based on historical trade, pragmatic survival needs given German dominance, a delicate, criticized balancing act. But importantly, Sweden also undertook significant humanitarian actions, refuge for thousands fleeing Hitler, including Danish Norwegian Jews, dissidents. Later, Swedish diplomats played roles facilitating contacts, negotiations contributing to post-war stability, including efforts to save Hungarian Jews.
Sound like a very precarious, ethically challenging situation, trying to protect itself while also acting humanely. Let's look at the post-war reconstruction period. How did Sweden rebuild and develop then?
Post-WWII was a time of significant economic rejuvenation, social stabilization. Pre-war collaborative labor relations, like the 1936 Saltsjöbaden Agreement, helped smooth the transition. Sweden's wartime economic expansion, trading with both sides, provided a solid base. Rapid industrial growth, tech advances, engines, ships, engineering followed. This positioned Sweden well internationally as others rebuilt. Domestically, the dominant Social Democrats pursued interventionist policies expanding welfare, infrastructure. Despite some pessimistic predictions, Sweden saw substantial post-war growth during this period of government involvement. Political debate, 1944-48, focused on balancing intervention in free markets, with Social Democrats eventually moderating some rhetoric. Cultural exports, especially music, also surged, building on national romantic foundations.
So post-war was economic prosperity, further development of the social model, and growing international cultural presence. Let's bring focus to modern Sweden now, its defining characteristics today.
Modern Sweden, shaped by those 20th century transformations, is really seen as innovative, globally recognized, skillfully balancing tradition with progress. Leveraging its unique geopolitical position, it's also become influential culturally, exporting music and more. Artistic figures, often drawing from national romanticism, capitalized on history, myth, folklore, creating a distinctive cultural narrative resonating widely. Strategic cultural policies actively promoted export, recognizing it as soft power. Artists adeptly navigated national themes and international appeal, highlighting a multifaceted Swedish identity, an environment where traditional and progressive ideas coexist. These cultural foundations underpin later tech and economic advances, integrating Sweden globally. Modern Sweden is defined by maintaining national identity while embracing innovation and global collaboration, a dynamic interplay where arts play a vital role.
And social democracy has been absolutely central to modern Sweden's development.
Pivotal, yes, in sculpting the modern welfare state. The Social Democratic Party's engagement involved both advocacy and critique. They were builders and reformers. Their stance fluctuated, showing dynamism. They were key in 20th century industrial and social reforms, harnessing state power for economic advancement and social welfare. This often involved strategically using state mechanisms. Even achieving universal suffrage was tied to working within the parliamentary system. Interwar, they took a pragmatic approach, similar to bourgeois counterparts, promoting industrialization, electricity. The interplay between tech advances, electrification, water power, and nationwide welfare goals defined much of its modernization path.
And the economic growth in the mid-20th century was another defining feature. What fueled that?
That significant mid-20th century growth was driven by a unique mix. Private enterprise within a framework of robust government intervention and welfare policies. This led to the Scandinavian economic model, combining competitive markets with comprehensive welfare. Sweden's model influenced other Nordic countries. Government policies provided the framework for rapid industrial development, higher living standards. Strategic interventions aimed at economic stability, equity, rooted in the people's home, Folkhemmet ideology. Active role in regulating labor markets, redistributing income via progressive tax, social security. The persistent challenge was, and is, balancing government oversight and market freedom for sustainable growth, avoiding Eurosclerosis. Synergy between private sector innovation efficiency and government policies ensuring equitable benefit sharing was key. Continuous dialogue between policy and practice provided resilience, a pragmatic approach reflecting adaptability and underlying tensions in sustaining the model.
And finally, joining the European Union in the mid-90s was another big step in modern history.
Sweden joining the EU January 1, 1995 was significant, following political and economic considerations and a positive public referendum vote in late '94. Since then, the ongoing challenge is adapting domestic policies to EU rules while balancing national interests requiring negotiation capacity building. Notably, Sweden chose not to adopt the euro, citing economic sovereignty concerns, public skepticism. Perception shifted somewhat during its 2001 EU presidency, linked to economic factors like the krona's performance. Post-accession, Sweden has actively shaped EU policies, advocating for environmental sustainability, human rights, gender equality. It reflects commitment to global cooperation, European ideals. It's a strategic effort to leverage EU membership for economic political gain, while cautious on monetary matters like the EMU. A nuanced balance between integration and maintaining national ethos, showing adept navigation within the EU.
So, modern Sweden. Complex path shaped by history, social welfare, neutrality, economic adaptability, vibrant culture, EU engagement. Let's delve into its multifaceted cultural heritage now.
Sweden's cultural heritage is incredibly rich, woven from diverse threads, indigenous traditions going back millennia, enriched by centuries of external cultural exchange. A fascinating aspect is its music heritage, especially its 20th century rise as a major exporter shaping identity. As we noted, early 1900s national romanticism saw composers draw on national myths for operas, forging strong links between art and Swedish identity. This awakening fostered a unique domestic scene, but also emphasized art-music export. National politics intertwined with music, influencing how composers sought international recognition while maintaining cultural integrity. But heritage goes far beyond music, vernacular expressions, crafts, how institutions manage heritage. Heritage plays a vital role mobilizing the past for contemporary identities, gaining symbolic importance. Studies like on the American Swedish Institute in Minneapolis show how Swedish culture is staged abroad. Contemporary politics, market forces impact identity politics. Discrepancies sometimes arise between vernacular traditions and official narratives, revealing tensions in how heritage is perceived.
And alongside music, literature, and the broader arts have been crucial in shaping identity and contributing globally.
Absolutely. Late 19th, early 20th century saw huge literary developments. Strindberg, Selma Lagerlöf, first female Nobel Lit Laureate, 1909. National romantic sentiment resonated in arts literature, interest in folklore, myth, nature. 20th century brought modernism, integrating national themes with European movements, Expressionism, Cubism. Institutions like the Swedish Arts Council became prominent in promoting arts, supporting both tradition and avant-garde design, shaping diverse cultural infrastructure. And as we've stressed, the 20th century was transformative for music, becoming a significant exporter, developing infrastructure influenced by national romanticism but expanding genres. Music politics supporting creation distribution of works, drawing on national mythos, building distinct identity. Global engagement positioned Sweden as key in cultural diplomacy.
And film has also become a vital pillar of modern Swedish cultural expression.
Yes, film is crucial now, an outlet for creativity, showcasing Swedish talent and stories internationally. Music plays a huge role in enriching Swedish film, enhancing storytelling, emotional depth, cultural richness. Filmmakers consistently prioritize integrating music thoughtfully, showing diversity in musical expression. The 20th century intertwining of music and film marked a dynamic era of collaboration, innovation, solidifying both as integral, internationally recognized parts of Swedish cultural identity.
Finally, let's touch on traditional festivals, still a vibrant part of cultural life, reflecting centuries of heritage.
Traditional festivals have evolved over centuries, embodying rich heritage, reflecting societal changes while keeping customs alive. St. Lucia's Day, December 13th, marking Christmas season onset, is a great example, with its solemn, candlelit processions. The mid-20th century saw the blonde Lucia maiden custom become widespread, symbolizing light and darkness. Interestingly, integrating the Tomtate, folkloric dwarf, into Lucia processions shows adaptation blending global influences with national customs. Christmas decorations often respect historical aesthetics, candles, evergreens. Churches remain important for reflection, community. Gatherings like Swedish Estonians in Stockholm St. Jacob's Church highlight how religious practice intertwines with identity, belonging, sometimes cultural resistance, like against past Soviet influence. Festivals like St. Lucia capture national identity through enduring, adaptive traditions.
So, cultural heritage. Dynamic, rooted in history, yet open to influence, vital in shaping modern identity. Let's turn now to Sweden's significant, often distinctive role in global affairs.
Sweden has indeed played a distinctive, often influential global role in the 20th to 21st centuries, driven by neutrality and strategic international diplomacy. Maintaining neutrality through world wars, Cold War allowed it to be non-aligned. This positioned it as a mediator, proponent of disarmament, peacekeeping. Foreign policies often blend pragmatism and idealism, striving for global stability. Since joining the EU in 1995, its role in European politics evolved. It's wielded influence within the EU, especially during its presidency, despite initial skepticism emphasizing transparency, conflict prevention. While cautious on EMU, leadership on transparency regulation is acknowledged. Also, its role as a cultural exporter, especially music, shaped by its position between blocs, extends influence beyond traditional politics. Cultural diplomacy is part of its global engagement. Overall, multidimensional involvement, exercising soft power, supporting international cooperation, cultural exchange.
And peacekeeping missions under UN auspices have been particularly significant.
Absolutely. Sweden has a distinguished commitment to international peacekeeping, rooted in neutrality, non-alignment. Participation in UN initiatives highlights dedication to stability, conflict resolution, reinforced its image as peaceful, stabilizing force. Role grew from mid-20th century, participating in numerous missions globally. Ethos centers on humanitarian aid, ceasefire monitoring, supporting elections. Swedish personnel noted for professionalism, impartiality, earning trust, reflects commitment to international peace via multilateralism while respecting neutrality. Diplomacy also promotes peace via diplomatic channels, disarmament advocacy, mediation. Approach balances humanitarian aid and strategic diplomacy. Reflects broader societal values, human rights, global cooperation.
Humanitarian aid is another crucial pillar of its global engagement.
Indeed, Sweden has a rich history here, consistently committed to international assistance. Swedish NGOs are pivotal in post-conflict settlements, Afghanistan, Palestine, providing resources, supporting infrastructure. Public support for foreign aid is relatively high. Significant citizen participation in UN humanitarian programs, too. Swedish companies also contribute, like IKEA being a top UNICEF corporate donor. While government aid allocation can sometimes be influenced by politics, different parties prioritizing different regions, potentially impacting effectiveness, the sustained overall commitment remains a defining, respected aspect of its international profile.
Finally, Sweden has emerged as a global leader on environmental issues.
Absolutely, a global leader harnessing policy innovation, tech, community engagement. Ambitious goals, international collaboration to fight climate change, promote sustainability, puts ecosystem health at policy forefront, pioneering strategies for local global impact, exemplary commitment to renewables, major investments in wind, solar. Goal, carbon neutral by 2045, enacting policies for green energy, transport electrification. Initiated sustainable urban development programs, green spaces, eco-friendly transport. Champions environmental advocacy internationally. Hosting conferences, shaping agreements. Rigorous recycling, waste management policies, encouraging circular economy. Unwavering focus on combating environmental degradation offers a model for sustainable governance.
So, Sweden's global role is truly multifaceted: peacekeeping, humanitarian aid, environmental leadership.
Indeed, neutrality provided a unique platform for principled, impactful global engagement.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into Sweden's history, it's really quite something to reflect on its journey. From those earliest settlements to the innovative, globally recognized nation it is today, it's a compelling story of resilience, adaptation, and progress.
We've traced how its strategic position, its vibrant cultural heritage, its commitment to societal development all shaped its unique path. And culture, especially music and arts, has been a constant, vital vehicle for national expression and identity throughout.
And it's worth hitting again how Sweden became a notable player in global music export early in the 20th century during that national romantic era. Composers like Helen with Harold Viking or Peterson Berger with Arnold Jot really captured that spirit, drawing on Swedish myth and legend.
Ultimately, Sweden's history is a powerful testament to its adaptive spirit, able to preserve heritage while embracing innovation and global collaboration. It offers a compelling model of resilience and progress that resonates globally.
So as you think about Sweden's journey, perhaps consider that continuous interplay between its history, its cultural wealth, and its dynamic path forward. How does that unique balance contribute to its ongoing influence and place in the world? Something to mull over. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.